Everybody knows that the Normans conquered England in 1066, but did you know that the French had another crack at invading in 1216? And that was because King John was a bad king, a very bad king. Now this place, Dover Castle, has a key role to play in the events of 1216. I'm going to find out all about it, but first I need to go and meet a historian who can give me the background. Now then, you look like just the man I need to see. Paul, how are you?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
Good, I'm brilliant. So you're an English heritage historian. You know all about Dover Castle. Give me the top line on Dover Castle. 20 seconds. What is this?
So yeah, this is the best castle in England. Just look at it. What a magnificent sight, and instantly recognisable between 1216 and now. Foreground has changed, but all of the middle ground and all of the background is exactly more or less as it would have appeared to the French and the rebels at the time.
So let's just hone in on what's happening in 1215. So King John, he's a bad king. He spent most of his reign, he came to the throne in 1199, upsetting his barons. He lost Normandy in 1204, which upset all his Anglo-Norman barons, and then he spent the rest of his reign basically rinsing his barons for money and upsetting them. So what happens in 1215 to really kick things off and get this story going?
Well, by 1215, a large group of barons had kind of had enough, and they begin to take arms against John. There are a series of negotiations which happen. The barons present King John with a series of articles, which are the things that are going to address all these grievances that they have against him. Magna Carta is signed at Runnymede. But by that time, it's actually too late, because neither side really trust each other. John had probably signed because he was under pressure to do so and was in a tricky position, playing for time. But actually, after it was signed, there were a few attempts to implement some of the clauses, but by and large, everybody goes away and starts to prepare for war. And indeed, that's what happens.
King John probably fancied his chances against the rebel English barons. And in fact, the initial phases of the war went pretty well for him. So well that the rebel barons sent representation to the King of France, Philip Augustus, to ask him to help out. His son, Prince Louis, without official sanction from his father, responded to their call and arrived in England with an army. Suddenly the stakes had gone up massively, and the advantage shifted from John to the rebel barons and their new ally, Louis. The war was conducted via a series of sieges all over the country, and Dover Castle was a particularly important place to control. It was held for the king by Hubert de Burgh, and Louis himself, with part of his army, assembled here in spring and early summer of 1216. With hostile intent. Okay, so it's 1216, spring 1216.
Yeah.
The French prince, Louis, is here with some of his French soldiers and presumably some of the English rebels as well.
Indeed.
Are they here? Are they right here? Where would they have been positioned, do you think?
Yeah, pretty much where you're standing.
Yeah, okay.
So,
bonjour.
We are here on the site of the Barbican.
Yep.
We don't know its exact perimeter. We might have been slightly outside it, we might be slightly inside it. But this is where they were. The camp is just over here,
Yep.
a few hundred meters away. This is the vulnerable part of the castle because it's the only place of level access. Otherwise, the sides of the castle are too steep. The far end of it, you've got the White Cliffs.
Yeah.
So this northern tip of the castle is the place where they're going to attack.
So, we need to tell the story of the 1216 siege. So we've got Louis and his French forces, they're ranged around here. How do they plan to take this amazing, powerful castle?
Right, well, they do a number of things. But the first obstacle to get past was the Barbican.
Yeah.
So we're standing on the edge of it.
Yeah.
It's over to my left. And this was an earthwork defence with a timber palisade, still quite strong, with towers and a gate.
Yeah.
They had to get past that because that guards a bridge that led across to my right onto the area of the North Gate.
Yeah.
Yeah. They undermine it. Obviously, they batter it with siege engines, and there's crossbowmen, and there's all the usual kind of hand-to-hand stuff.
Yeah, but they literally dig underneath.
They literally dig underneath. They have a siege tower as well that's pouring crossbow fire into the defended area inside the Barbican, but they mine underneath it, and they bring it crashing down. The way they do that is they create a cavity. And in that cavity, underneath the rampart, they fill it full of combustible material, set fire to it, okay, and they've propped that area up, yeah? The props burn out, and the whole thing collapses down. Yeah. That's exactly what happened. Yeah. And then the French and rebel forces stormed through that breach and captured the Barbican. Stage 1, done.
So that's summer 1216, they're in here. They're basically
Absolutely.
where we are. Looking at this thinking, looks a bit tricksy.
Yes, especially the next bit. Yeah. Because they've got that to get into.
So what do?
They bombard the castle. Siege engines are just pouring fire in there. They're looking for soldiers on the ramparts, trying to pick them off, and vice versa. So there's this, this bloody kind of close quarters warfare going on. All the while, the French miners are burrowing somewhere underneath here, just behind me. Yeah. Because their target is the North Gate. Yeah. The North Gate is just to the left of the big round tower we can see, and it's the one that sits forward. It's got like a beak. It sits forward. That was constructed after the siege to block the North Gate. So if we were here in 1216 looking now, we'd see an archway which was the way in to the outer bailey of the castle. That's where they had to get. So they undermine, imagine it too, look at the slope. They had to mine underneath that, create this cavity underneath the North Gate, prop it with timbers, and do the same thing, set it on fire, which is exactly what they did. It took a little while, but as those props burned out, one of the towers flanking the gateway was undermined and came crashing down. And what you get is an equally steep slope, but it's rubble and there's a gap in the wall. Yeah. And then you have to get an incredibly intrepid group of soldiers to get up there in chainmail, shields, swords, battle axes, spears, trying to climb that slope under fire. But they do it. Miraculously, a French and rebel force actually get through the breach inside the castle.
So they're in. The French are in. Game over.
No, not quite. Not quite.
Yes, the French had got through 2 layers of defence, the Barbican and the outer bailey, but there was still the small matter of the inner bailey in their way. And of course, the defenders inside knew that they were coming, so they would have set up further defences and barricades and got their crossbowmen ready to rain death down on the attackers as well. There would have been one hell of a battle between the inner and outer bailey walls.
Fortunately, the defending side get the upper hand and gradually force them back out again through that bridge. It's still open though, isn't it? You know? And there's still fighting going on. Whether or not the French made any more attempts to get in, we don't know. But the end product was that the engineers, the English engineers inside, have assembled all sorts of materials just for this eventuality. And so they bring lots of timber, they gather up loose stone, and they produce a barricade across the breach.
The barricades held, and the French were forced to camp out on the Barbican once more. By October 1216, there was something of a stalemate. But then there was a big moment in the course of the war. It didn't happen at Dover. It happened at Newark, in the Midlands, because that is where the much maligned King John died on the 19th of October, probably from dysentery. That completely changed the dynamic of the war, and John's son, the young Henry III, was quickly crowned in Gloucester. Westminster Abbey wasn't available at the time as the French held London. Henry hadn't been alive long enough to become the focus of as much opprobrium as John did, and so the heat was taken out of the rebels' cause. Gradually, support began to flow back towards the royal side over the winter of 1216, but the war was far from over. Prince Louis still thought he had a chance to grab the throne, and with his French army still at large and enough English barons still willing to back him, 1217 dawned with war very much in play across the land, and a very tense situation in Dover. What's happening right here in Dover as we move into 1217 then?
Well, Louis had called a truce with Hubert de Burgh, who is the defender of this castle. Yeah. And that truce was supposed to hold over the winter, but in fact, the truce was kept badly by the English side. Okay. And there was guerrilla warfare going on locally. Yeah. including some attacks on the French camp, which was outside the castle, by local supporters of the English side. In fact, part of the French camp was burned. And so in May 1217, the French and the rebel Baron force attempts to reassemble outside the castle and start it all over again.
Right, and Louis and the French, they've got a secret weapon, haven't they? Although maybe not so secret, something a bit like this.
A bit like this, yeah. This is a small version of something called a Perrier,
Yep.
or a traction trebuchet.
Yep.
It's called that because it's operated by hand.
Yep.
But the secret weapon that you're alluding to is what we understand popularly as a trebuchet,
Yeah.
which is something that's much, much bigger than this. And it looks rather similar, but it has a huge counterweight on the far side. So instead of using human power
Yeah.
to propel the projectile, it uses a counterweight, which is raised high mechanically.
Yeah.
And then when it drops, it propels the sling at enormous force
Yeah.
towards its target.
Okay.
And this, in fact, we think that's the first instance of it being recorded as being used on English soil. So trebuchets, they weren't very common at the time.
So what happened in that 1217 siege? Did the French actually manage to break through using these siege engines they brought?
No, they didn't. And in truth, we know far more about the 1216 siege than we know about the 1217 siege from contemporary accounts. All we know is that it began in May 1217. It didn't last all that long when the action actually transfers to other parts of the country.
There were two significant events, one in Lincoln and one in the sea off Sandwich, not too far from here, on the Channel coast. Lincoln, like Dover, had been besieged by the French. One of Henry III's regents, the famous William Marshal, led a strong relief army and defeated the French forces. It was a significant reverse for the rebels and caused more of them to swap back to the royalist side. Prince Louis was down, but he was not out. He needed reinforcements from France, and there were several attempts to get them across the Channel, but they couldn't come to Dover because the castle still stood for Henry. So instead, a large fleet headed to Sandwich, hundreds of ships under the command of a notorious figure called Eustace the Monk, who actually fought for both sides in the conflict. An English defence fleet was massed, and there was a huge sea battle, in which the French were once more defeated. Louis's chances of resupply were shot, so the conflict reached a stalemate. So what does happen in the end to conclude the events of 1216 and 1217?
I think the truth of the matter is that Louis realised that he no longer had the fulsome support of all the rebel English barons that he had enjoyed earlier. And so he has to come to the negotiation table. And that happens in London. And eventually a treaty is agreed upon whereby Louis is compensated financially to go away, but Henry III is recognised as the legitimate heir and the King of England.
Yeah.
And so the war concludes, and Louis goes home with his pockets full, but perhaps with his tail between his legs.
So we're here in Dover. How important was what happened in Dover Castle to the outcome of this civil war?
Very important. Later on, one of the chroniclers who talks about this period puts words into the mouth of Hubert de Burgh, and Hubert de Burgh is quoted as saying, "Dover is the key to England." And there is a lot of merit in that idea, because if you think of its position, now as then, it's a very key location for cross-channel communications. And if you think about the time when we're talking about sailing vessels and the precariousness of sailing at sea, the awkward tides and winds that you get, Dover is the perfect place from which to land a force and resupply a force. It has a port. It's the only gap in the White Cliffs for about 12 miles. It is the place where Louis would have been supplied from and resupplied from constantly. So in order to do that, he needs the castle. Because if he doesn't capture the castle, the garrison of the castle could at any point cut his communications. And that's why the castle was so important for Louis to capture.
So that is the story of the 1216-17 siege, but there's so much more at Dover Castle. This, for instance, is a Roman lighthouse, and that is an Anglo-Saxon church. Over there is a load of World War II defences. There's so much here at Dover, so many stories to tell, but they're going to have to wait for another day.